Welcome to the Pigeon Hero of WWI. The American soldiers were doomed. It was October 1918, not long before the end of World War I. This was a war more brutal than any before in history. It would leave 17 million people dead and pull more than 135 countries, including the United States, into battles around the globe. Now, in a dark, rainy forest in northeastern France, several hundred American troops were in a fight for their lives. The men were surrounded by enemy German soldiers. Machine guns rattled, bombs rained from the sky. The Americans needed help. Their only hope was to get an urgent message to their leaders 25 miles away. But how? There was no walkie-talkies or cell phones in 1918, no computers to send emails, and the army radios weren't working. Luckily, there was one brave warrior who had been trained for a moment exactly like this one. She took the message on a life or death race across the forest. Her name was Cher Amie, and she was not a soldier. She was not even human. She was a pigeon. Incredible powers. Cher Amie, French for dear friend, was one of thousands of pigeons who served with American soldiers during World War I. These birds were a breed known as carrier pigeons or homing pigeons. They had an important job to carry messages. Why would the military use pigeons as messengers? For one thing, these pigeons are fast. Some can fly up to 90 miles per hour. They are also smart. A pigeon's brain is no bigger than a wad of bubblegum. But, like the tiny chip in an iPhone, that pigeon brain is packed with power. For example, pigeons can be trained to recognize letters and words. But what truly makes these pigeons ideal for carrying messages is their ability to return to their home nest, no matter how far away it is. Nobody needs to show them how to get home. They just know. These gray birds can travel over seas and mountains across hundreds of twisting miles. They almost never get lost. It's this remarkable power of navigation that makes pigeons such good messengers. If you want to use a pigeon as a messenger, you would teach it that its home was on your roof. You could take the bird with you to a friend's house, keeping it safe in its cage. When you were ready to be picked up, you would write a message and place it in a pinky-sized metal tube attached to the pigeon's leg. You'd release your pigeon. It would carry your message back home, and soon someone would come and get you. Brutal battles. Long before the days of phones, texts, and FaceTime, the only way to send a message over long distances was to send a human runner or a pigeon. Ship captains used pigeons to send weather reports back to shore. Knights took pigeons with them into battle and used them to send news back to their kings. At the first Olympics, nearly 3,000 years ago, pigeons carried the results of chariot races to surrounding cities. In the 1800s, new inventions like telegraph and telephone transformed the way humans communicated. But in wartime, getting information across long distances was still difficult, especially during battles. And in World War I, the battles were bigger and bloodier than any the world had ever seen. New weapons unleashed terror and death on a massive scale. Machine guns fired hundreds of bullets per minute. Poison gas caused blistering burns and scorched lungs. Airplanes dropped bombs that caused huge explosions. Modern technologies had made killing all too easy, but when it came to sending messages from a battlefield, no new invention was as reliable as the pigeon. Mud, rats, and fear. Cher Amie was born in England and trained by one of the country's most famous pigeon experts. She was brought to France to serve during World War I. Cher Amie's home nest was at the American Army headquarters near a forest called Argonne. In peacetime, Argonne was a fairy tale forest of towering trees and babbling brooks. But by the time Cher Amie arrived in France, World War I had been dragging on for 4 years. The forests and fields of France had been transformed into blood-soaked battlefields, haunted by ghosts of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers. These battles were fought with something called trench warfare. Trenches were deep, narrow ditches that stretched for miles. Soldiers would stay inside these trenches, which offered some and very little protection from bullets and grenades, until it was time to push forward. Progress was slow and bloody. Each time the men left their own trench, they faced a storm of gunfire and bombs. But men didn't just fight from the trenches. They lived in them 24 hours a day, often for weeks at a time. They coped with knee-deep mud and a sickening stench of garbage and human waste, with rampant disease, with constant fear. The noise of machine guns, the bombs' blasts, made sleep almost impossible. Soldiers who did manage to fall asleep often awoke to rats scurrying across their chests. Cher Amie joined the men of the 77th Infantry Division, part of the large battalion of American soldiers. The man in charge was Major Charles Whittlesey, had been ordered to lead his troops in an attack on the Germans in Argonne. Cher Amie was one of the 8 pigeons brought on the mission. The birds lived together in a cage. They were cared for by a young soldier from New York. He did his best to keep them safe as the troops moved through the forest under attack. Deep in the forest on October 3rd, Whittlesey's men marched into the path of a large German force. The Americans were soon surrounded and went under fierce attack. The men, there were about 550 of them, tried to fight back, but they were low on ammunition, badly outnumbered and exhausted. After all, many of them had not slept in weeks, hadn't had much sleep for weeks. Food had been running low. The only way the men could get a sip of water was to risk crawling out and going through the mud to a stream. The Germans pummeled the American troops with artillery, blasting them with powerful explosions and grenades and rapid-fire machine guns. With each passing hour, more men were killed or wounded. Whittlesey kept sending out pigeons carrying desperate requests for help, but one by one the pigeons were shot or disappeared. Finally, the next day, American planes appeared overhead. Whittlesey's men cheered. They believed they were about to be rescued. The planes would drop much-needed food, ammunition, and other supplies. But it wasn't food and bullets those planes were dropping. It was bombs. Whittlesey's understood the horror that the Americans didn't realize, that he and his men were in the part of the forest. The bombs were meant for the Germans, but instead they were killing Whittlesey's men. The major frantically scrawled a message announcing their location in the woods and that they were under American attack. The message ended with a plea, "For heaven's sake, stop it." A feathered missile. By this time, only 2 pigeons were left, Cher Amie and the other. It was the other pigeon that was pulled from the cage first. But the bird was so terrified that it flapped away before the message could be placed in its tube. Now it was up to Cher Amie. Hands reached into the cage and gently lifted her out. When the message was secure, she was set free. She fluttered up to a tree and perched there, rock still. It was as though she needed a moment to collect her courage. And then she took off, like a tiny feathered missile. The sky was a storm of bullets and shards of bomb-shattered trees. Almost immediately, a bullet hit her in the eye. She began falling toward the ground, bleeding. But Cher Amie didn't give up. She flapped her wings and rose skyward again. Another bullet hit her, this time in the chest. She kept flying. A third bullet struck her right leg and nearly tore it off. But she kept flying. 20 minutes after she'd taken off, Cher Amie, bloodied, half-blind, and with her leg hanging by a thread, arrived at headquarters with her message. The bombing had halted and soldiers were sent to rescue Whittlesey and his men. Meanwhile, medics worked feverishly to save Cher Amie's life. Her leg had been amputated, or had to be amputated, but Cher Amie survived. She was fitted with a tiny wooden leg. News of her miraculous journey spread around the world. She was awarded a medal and sent to America, where she was greeted as a hero who had saved the lives of nearly 200 men. World War I ended 5 weeks after the last flight of Cher Amie. This terrible war caused death and the suffering for people around the world. But in the midst of this misery emerged stories of great bravery and heroism, like the story of Cher Amie, the courageous pigeon hero of World War I. Thank you for listening.